The diner smelled like burnt coffee and decades of grease that no amount of bleach could scrub away. I inhaled it like oxygen because it was familiar, because it meant another shift, another handful of crumpled bills that might keep the electricity on for one more week. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a persistent hum that had become the soundtrack to my exhaustion, flickering occasionally, as if they too were barely holding on. My feet ached in shoes held together more by duct tape than stitching. I'd worked a double yesterday, and the day before that, and probably the day before that too. Time blurred when you were drowning, when you'd become invisible to everyone who walked past you on the street, who looked through you like you were made of glass. "Table 7 needs a refill," barked Maurice from behind the counter, not bothering to look up from his crossword puzzle. He never looked up. None of them did. I grabbed the coffee pot, its handle warm against my perpetually cold fingers, and made my way through the narrow aisle between booths. The lunch rush had died down to a trickle. Just a few truckers nursing their third cups, and a businessman who'd been typing furiously on his laptop for the past 2 hours, ordering nothing but water with lemon. That's when I saw her. She sat alone in the corner booth, the one with the torn vinyl that we kept meaning to fix but never did. She was old, ancient really, with paper-thin skin that looked almost translucent under the harsh lighting. Her hands trembled as she tried to lift the menu, the laminated pages shaking so violently that I could hear them rustling from 10 feet away. Something twisted in my chest. Recognition, maybe. Not of her specifically, but of that particular brand of loneliness that settles into your bones when the world has decided you no longer matter. I approached her table with the coffee pot extended like an offering. "Can I get you something to drink, ma'am?" She looked up at me with eyes that were a startling shade of gray, sharp despite the cloudiness of age, like steel wrapped in gauze. Her gaze traveled over my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. But I held steady. I'd learned long ago that looking away was the same as disappearing. "Coffee," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite the tremor in her hands. "Black. And perhaps you could help me read this menu? My eyes aren't what they used to be." "Of course." I set down the pot and slid into the booth across from her without thinking, without asking if it was okay. Maurice would kill me if he saw. Waitresses weren't supposed to sit with customers, but something about this woman made all those stupid rules seem even more meaningless than usual. I read through the options slowly, describing each dish in more detail than the menu provided, adding which ones I thought were actually edible, and which ones to avoid. She listened with a small smile playing at her lips, occasionally asking questions about ingredients or preparation in a way that suggested she knew far more about cooking than our greasy spoon could ever deliver. "The meatloaf," she finally decided, "and mashed potatoes. Real ones, not instant." "Real ones," I confirmed, though that was generous. "They came from a box, but at least they required actual water and butter." "You're kind," she said as I started to stand. Her hand shot out faster than I would have thought possible for someone her age, wrapping around my wrist with surprising strength. Her skin was cool and dry, like parchment. "What's your name, child?" "Sarah," I told her, unsure why my voice came out softer than intended. "Sarah Mitchell. Sarah." She repeated it like she was tasting the syllables, testing their weight. "A good name. Strong. Biblical." I nodded, though I'd never felt particularly strong. My mother had named me after a grandmother I'd never met, a woman who'd apparently survived the Depression by sheer force of will. I wondered sometimes if survival ran in families like eye color or the tendency toward addiction, if it was something you could inherit along with debt and disappointment. "I'll get your order in," I said, gently extracting my wrist from her grip. The afternoon crawled forward with the sluggish pace of honey dripping from a spoon. I brought the old woman her meatloaf, watched her eat with careful, measured bites, refilled her coffee 3 times. She didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave, and I found myself checking on her more often than necessary, drawn back to that corner booth by something I couldn't name. Between refills, I caught her watching me. Not the vacant stare of someone lost in their own thoughts, but an active observation, cataloging, assessing. It should have made me uncomfortable, but instead I felt seen. Actually seen, maybe for the first time in months. You work hard, she commented during one of my visits to her table. It wasn't a question. Trying to, I said, wiping down the already clean surface with a rag that had seen better days. Bills don't pay themselves. Family? Just me now. The words came out more bitter than I intended. I thought about softening them, adding some explanation, but what was the point? The truth was the truth. My mother had drunk herself to death 2 years ago, and my father had never been more than a name on a birth certificate I'd lost during one of our many evictions. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. The hardest workers are always the ones with the most to lose. Before I could respond, the bell above the door chimed. I glanced up out of habit and felt my stomach drop. 3 men walked in. No, they didn't walk. They entered. There was a difference. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having to look over their shoulder, never having to wonder if they belonged. 2 of them were massive, built like brick walls stuffed into expensive suits that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. They flanked the 3rd man like satellites orbiting a planet. The 3rd man. I couldn't look away from him even though everything in me screamed to drop my gaze, to become invisible the way I'd perfected over years of practice. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on ancient Roman coins. Sharp angles and strong bones, a jaw that could cut glass. But it was his eyes that trapped me. Dark as espresso, and just as bitter, scanning the diner with the mechanical precision of someone assessing threats and exits in the same glance. He wore all black, a suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body, a shirt with no tie, the top button undone just enough to reveal a glimpse of a thick neck. On his left hand, a gold signet ring caught the light. Even from across the room, I could feel the weight of money radiating off him like heat. The diner went quiet. Even Maurice looked up from his crossword. The man's gaze swept the room once, twice, then landed on the corner booth, on the old woman. His entire demeanor shifted, the predatory assessment melting into something I couldn't quite read. Concern? Fear? No, not fear. Men like that didn't do fear. Respect. He crossed the diner in long strides, his bodyguards following like shadows. I stood frozen next to the old woman's table, suddenly aware of how threadbare my uniform was, how the coffee pot in my hand was chipped at the spout, how utterly out of place these people were in this grease-stained corner of nowhere. "Nona," the man said, and his voice was like velvet wrapped around steel, smooth and dark and dangerous. He spoke the word with an accent I couldn't place. Something European, maybe, or just the particular cadence of old money and older bloodlines. The old woman, Nonna, smiled up at him with genuine warmth that transformed her face. "Domenico, you're late." "Traffic," he said, though something in his tone suggested that traffic didn't usually dare to delay him. His eyes flicked to me, and I felt that gaze like a physical touch, traveling from my scuffed shoes up to my face with an assessment that made my skin prickle. "Who's this?" "Sarah," the old woman said before I could answer. "She's been taking excellent care of me." "Has she?" It wasn't a question. He continued to stare at me, and I realized with a jolt that his eyes weren't actually black. They were such a dark brown they only looked black in the dim diner lighting. Up close, I could see flecks of amber near the pupils, like embers in cooling coal. I should have said something, anything. But my mouth had gone dry, and all I could think about was how his presence seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room, how even standing 5 feet away from him felt like standing too close to a fire. I started, gesturing vaguely with the coffee pot toward other tables that didn't need me, toward anywhere that wasn't here. "Stay," the old woman said, and again that surprising strength in her voice. "I haven't paid yet. Of course, the check." I fumbled in my apron pocket for the pad, my hands suddenly clumsy, fingers not working quite right. I scribbled the total, $12.47, including the upcharge for real mashed potatoes, and set it on the table. The man, Domenico, pulled out a wallet that looked like it was made from some kind of exotic leather. Crocodile, maybe. He extracted several bills without looking at them and dropped them on the table. I glanced down and felt my heart stop. Hundreds. 5 of them. $500 for a $12 meal. "Sir?" I can't. This is too much. I'll need to get change. Keep it, he said, his attention already shifting back to his grandmother. But then he paused, looked at me again with those burning ember eyes. You were kind to her. That matters. The old woman was struggling to stand, her movements slow and painful. Without thinking, I reached out to help her, supporting her elbow as she rose. She was lighter than I expected, fragile as a bird, and I found myself wondering how someone so delicate had managed to walk into the diner alone. Thank you, Sarah, she said, patting my hand with those cool, papery fingers. Then she leaned in close, so close I could smell her perfume. Something expensive and floral that didn't belong in a place that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. You have a good heart. Don't let this world take that from you. Before I could respond, Domenico had his arm around her, guiding her toward the door with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with everything else about him. The bodyguards followed, one of them holding the door open as they exited into the bright afternoon sunlight. I stood there like an idiot, holding $500 and a coffee pot, watching through the window as they helped the old woman into the back of a black SUV with tinted windows. Not just any SUV, something massive and sleek that probably had armor plating under the paint job. A second SUV was parked behind it, engine running. Holy shit, Maurice said from behind the counter. Do you know who that was? I turned to look at him, still dazed. Some rich guy helping his grandmother? Maurice laughed, but it sounded wrong. Too high, too nervous. That was Domenico Salvatore, and if that was his grandmother, he trailed off, his face going pale. Jesus, Sarah. That was Elena Salvatore. The Salvatores. The name meant nothing to me. I shook my head, confused. The Salvatore family, Maurice repeated, as if that should explain everything. When I continued to stare blankly, he added in a whisper, the Mafia, Sarah. That was the Salvatore crime family. And you just sat down and had lunch with the matriarch. The coffee pot slipped from my fingers, shattering on the linoleum floor in an explosion of glass and lukewarm coffee. I looked down at the mess, at my shoes now soaked and surrounded by shards, and thought absurdly that I couldn't afford to replace either the pot or the shoes. But all I could really focus on was the weight of those $500 bills in my apron pocket, and the memory of dark eyes that had looked at me like I was something more than invisible. Like I was something worth noticing. Like I had just made a mistake I couldn't even begin to understand. I didn't sleep that night. The money sat on my nightstand, 5 crisp $100 bills that seemed to glow in the darkness of my studio apartment, like radioactive material. I'd counted them 17 times, as if the number might change, as if they might transform into singles, or disappear altogether like some cruel magic trick. $500. I made that in 2 weeks if I was lucky, if the tips were good and Maurice didn't dock my pay for broken dishes or customer complaints. $500 could mean my rent paid on time for once. It could mean groceries that weren't expired clearance items. It could mean breathing room, just for a moment, just enough to stop the constant vice grip of panic that had become my normal. But every time I reached for the bills, my hand froze. The Salvatore family, the Mafia. I'd spent the hours after my shift Googling on my cracked phone screen, squinting at articles and news reports that painted a picture I wished I could unsee. The Salvatores weren't just wealthy, they were untouchable. Old money mixed with old crimes, a dynasty built on blood and secrets that went back generations. Domenico Salvatore himself was mentioned in dozens of articles, always carefully worded, always dancing around direct accusations. Alleged connections to organized crime, suspected money laundering, under investigation but never charged. The photos showed him at charity galas, at the openings of legitimate businesses, restaurants, hotels, import companies, always in expensive suits, always with that same predatory awareness in his eyes, even frozen in newsprint. In several photos, an older woman stood beside him, Elena Salvatore, his grandmother. The woman whose trembling hands I'd held while reading her a menu. I rolled onto my side, staring at the money in the thin light filtering through my broken blinds. The street lamp outside cast prison bar shadows across my floor, across the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere I'd never go, Across the pile of unpaid bills I kept meaning to organize but couldn't bring myself to touch. You were kind to her. That matters. His voice echoed in my head, that dark velvet wrapped around steel. I pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars, trying to push away the memory of how he'd looked at me. Really looked at me. Like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve, rather than another invisible waitress in another forgettable diner. By the time my alarm went off at 5 a.m., I'd convinced myself that it didn't matter who they were. I'd been kind to an old woman, that was all. I'd accepted a generous tip, that was all. Tomorrow, today now, technically, I'd go back to work, and everything would return to normal. They'd been passing through. People like that didn't come back to places like Maurice's diner. I was wrong. The black SUVs were parked outside when I arrived for my shift at 6. Same massive vehicles, same tinted windows that reflected the gray morning light like dark mirrors. My steps slowed on the sidewalk, my heart suddenly thundering so loud I could hear it in my ears. Maybe they weren't here for the diner, maybe they were visiting some other business on this street, though that seemed unlikely given that the other businesses included a laundromat, a pawn shop, and a boarded-up storefront that had once sold discount furniture. I forced myself to keep walking. I needed this job. I couldn't afford to be late, couldn't afford to give Maurice any reason to cut my hours. The door chimed as I pushed it open, and I immediately felt every eye in the place turn toward me. The diner was emptier than usual for the morning shift. Just 2 truckers at the counter, both of whom looked like they were trying very hard to focus on their eggs. And in the corner booth, the same corner booth from yesterday, sat Elena Salvatore. She smiled when she saw me, that same warm expression that had transformed her face before. Sarah, good morning. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I stood frozen in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights, my bag slipping from my shoulder to hang in the crook of my elbow. "Don't just stand there, Mitchell," Maurice hissed from behind the counter. His face was pale, sheened with sweat despite the morning chill. "Take the lady's order." Right. Order, that was my job. I was a waitress. This was a customer. The fact that this customer had a grandson who could probably make me disappear without a trace was irrelevant to my immediate responsibilities. I approached the booth on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, pulling out my order pad with fingers that trembled only slightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Salvatore. Coffee?" "You remembered how I take it?" she said, sounding pleased. "Black. And please call me Elena. Mrs. Salvatore makes me sound ancient." "You came back." The words slipped out before I could stop them. "I did." She folded her hands on the table, and I noticed she wasn't shaking today. Her movements were steady, controlled. The meatloaf was better than expected, and the company was excellent. Something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd spent enough years reading people, necessary when your survival depended on predicting which customers would tip and which would complain, which would leave quietly, and which would make a scene, to know when I was being tested. But for what? I couldn't begin to guess. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." I kept my voice neutral, professional. "What can I get you this morning?" She ordered oatmeal and toast, nothing that would take long to prepare. I brought her coffee, moving through the familiar motions with a strange sense of unreality, as if I were watching myself from a distance. When I set the cup down, she caught my wrist again, that same surprising strength. "Sit with me, Sarah." "I can't. I'm working." "Maurice," Elena called out, not loudly but with absolute authority. "You don't mind if Sarah takes her break now, do you?" Maurice practically tripped over himself. "No, ma'am, of course not. Sarah, take your break." I slid into the booth across from her because I didn't have a choice, because Maurice had just given me permission, because refusing seemed more dangerous than complying. The vinyl was cold through my thin uniform, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of how close the door was, how the 2 truckers were studiously not looking at us, how one of the bodyguards, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, stood just outside the window, watching. "You're afraid?" Elena observed. It wasn't a question. Should I be? The words came out sharper than intended, defense mechanism kicking in. She studied me for a long moment, those steel-gray eyes seeming to see past skin and bone to whatever lay beneath. "That depends. Are you planning to betray my trust?" "I don't even know you." No, she agreed, but you helped me yesterday. Not because you knew who I was, you clearly didn't, but because you saw an old woman struggling and you chose kindness. Do you know how rare that is? I thought about the streets I walked every day, the people who stepped over homeless veterans and ignored crying children, the way everyone seemed wrapped in their own survival to the point where compassion became a luxury no one could afford. Not that rare, I said quietly. Rarer than you think. She took a sip of her coffee, and I noticed she held the cup with both hands, as if savoring the warmth. My grandson has people watching me constantly. Bodyguards, drivers, security checking every location before I arrive. Yesterday I slipped away from them. Told my driver I was visiting a friend and had him drop me at the corner. I wanted to be just an old woman for a few hours, to see how people treat you when they don't know your name, your connections, your power. My stomach dropped. Yesterday was a test, not a test, an observation. She set down her cup. You failed to recognize me. You failed to offer special treatment. You failed to see me as anything other than another customer who needed help. She smiled. Those were the most refreshing failures I've experienced in decades. I didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched between us, filled with the distant clatter of dishes and the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own heartbeat. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked. Because my grandson wants to meet you properly. The words hit me like cold water. No. Sarah. No. I started to stand, but she caught my hand again, not grabbing, just touching, her papery fingers light against my skin. He won't hurt you. Domenico doesn't hurt people who show kindness to his family. Quite the opposite. I don't want to get involved with... I dropped my voice to a whisper, glancing around to make sure no one could hear. With people like you. No offense, but I can't afford that kind of attention. You can't afford not to have it, she said. And there was something almost sad in her voice. My dear, I know more about you than you realize. I know about your mother. I know about the evictions, the debt collectors, the notices from the electric company. I know you're working yourself to death in this diner for Maurice, who pays you below minimum wage because you're too afraid to report him. I know you're one emergency away from being on the street. Ice flooded my veins. You investigated me. I'm careful about who I allow into my life, even briefly. She released my hand, but what I found wasn't a threat. I found a young woman who's been dealt a terrible hand and is doing her best to play it with dignity. That's admirable. That's also unnecessary. What are you offering? A conversation. Dinner. Somewhere nice, not here. She gestured at the diner with a slight wrinkle of her nose. You'll be safe. You have my word. The word of a... I stopped myself, but she finished the sentence. The word of a criminal? Yes. But unlike many supposedly respectable people, when I give my word, I keep it. She pushed a card across the table, heavy stock, cream-colored, with an address embossed in gold. Tonight, 7 o'clock, a car will pick you up at your apartment. You know where I live. I know everything I need to know. She stood, moving with that same careful precision. Today's trembling hands had definitely been an act. Don't be afraid, Sarah. This could be the best thing that ever happened to you. Or you can refuse, and nothing changes. You'll keep working here until your body gives out, or Maurice finally fires you, and eventually, you'll disappear into the cracks like so many others. She leaned down, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But I don't think you want to disappear. I think you want to be seen. She left before I could respond, before I could process what had just happened. The bodyguard opened the door for her, and she disappeared into the back of the SUV like smoke dissolving into air. I sat in the booth long after she'd gone, staring at the card in my hand. The address meant nothing to me, but I could look it up, could decide, could choose. You okay? Maurice asked, hovering nearby with the coffee pot. He looked nervous, like I might shatter if he spoke too loudly. Fine, I lied. I'm fine. But I wasn't fine, because Elena Salvatore was right about one thing. I did want to be seen. I'd spent so long being invisible, being nothing, being the kind of person that the world looked through rather than at. And yesterday, for just a moment, I'd felt the weight of actual attention, Domenico Salvatore's dark eyes on me, seeing me, noticing me. It had terrified me. It had also felt like finally being able to breathe after drowning for years. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I moved through the motions mechanically, taking orders, delivering food, refilling coffee cups, while my mind spun in circles. The card seemed to burn through my apron pocket, a constant reminder that I had a decision to make. By the time I clocked out at 2 p.m., I'd almost convinced myself not to go. It was insane, dangerous, the kind of stupid decision that got people killed in movies and news reports. I didn't know these people. I didn't owe them anything. $500 was generous, but it wasn't worth getting tangled up with organized crime. I walked home through streets that seemed grayer than usual, past buildings that leaned toward each other like tired old men, past the corner where someone had spray-painted hope in dripping red letters that now looked more like a warning than inspiration. My apartment building loomed ahead. 5 stories of water-damaged brick and broken intercoms, the kind of place where you learned not to ask about the stains on the walls or the sounds you heard at night. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, my legs aching from the shift, and stopped dead. There was a dress hanging on my door. Not just any dress. Something that looked like it cost more than 3 months of my rent. Black silk that caught the hallway's dim lighting, with a designer label I recognized from magazine covers. A note was pinned to it in elegant script. For tonight. If you choose to come. My hands shook as I unlocked my door and brought the dress inside. I laid it on my bed, the bed that was really just a mattress on the floor, and stared at it for a long time. This was really happening. They were really expecting me. And somehow, despite every logical part of my brain screaming that this was a mistake, I found myself in the shower, washing away the smell of grease and coffee, preparing for something I couldn't even name. The dress fit perfectly. I stood in front of my cracked bathroom mirror, the only mirror I owned, and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The silk clung to curves I'd forgotten I had, curves that months of skipped meals and exhaustion had tried to erase. The neckline was modest but elegant, the hem falling just below my knees. Somehow they'd known my exact size. That thought should have terrified me more than it did. I'd used the last of my makeup, remnants from a life before my mother's death when I'd still believed in things like dates and futures. My hands trembled as I applied mascara, the wand nearly poking my eye twice. I didn't own heels that would work with this dress. Didn't own heels at all, really, so I'd settled for my least worn pair of flats, black canvas that had somehow survived relatively unscathed. At 6:55 p.m., I heard the car. Not the sound of a normal engine, but the purr of something expensive, something that didn't belong on my street any more than I belonged in this dress. I grabbed my bag, a worn canvas thing that clashed horribly with the silk, and made my way downstairs before I could change my mind. The SUV was parked directly in front of my building, as black and sleek as I remembered. The driver stood beside the rear door, a man in his 40s with the build of a boxer, and eyes that tracked every movement on the street with mechanical precision. When he saw me, he opened the door without a word. The interior smelled like leather and something else, expensive cologne maybe, or just the scent of money. I slid across the seat, the leather cool and buttery soft, and tried not to think about how many laws were probably being broken in vehicles just like this one. We drove in silence. The driver didn't speak, and I didn't ask questions, watching through tinted windows as my neighborhood gave way to better neighborhoods, which gave way to the kind of neighborhoods I'd only seen in magazines. Tree-lined streets with actual trees that looked healthy and maintained. Houses, no, mansions, set back from the road behind gates and walls. Gardens with flowers that someone actually watered. After 20 minutes, we turned onto a private road that wound up a hill. At the top sat a restaurant that looked like it had been transplanted from the Italian countryside, stone and vine-covered walls, warm light spilling from arched windows, a fountain in the courtyard that probably cost more than my entire apartment building. The driver opened my door, and I stepped out onto cobblestones that were smoother than the floors in my apartment. Another man in a suit, this one younger, with sharp features and an earpiece, gestured toward the entrance. "Ms. Mitchell." "They're expecting you." They. Not she. Not Elena. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked through the courtyard, past the fountain with its perfectly clear water, through doors held open by yet another suited man. The interior was dimly lit, all warm wood and soft candlelight, with tables spaced far enough apart that conversations would be impossible to overhear. Classical music played quietly in the background, something with strings that made me think of old movies and lives I'd never live. A woman in an elegant black dress approached, her smile professional and impersonal. "Ms. Mitchell, right this way." She led me through the main dining room, where well-dressed couples ate dishes I couldn't name, past a staircase with a velvet rope, up to the second floor where the lighting was even lower, the atmosphere even more intimate. We walked down a hallway lined with oil paintings, originals, by the look of them, until we reached a door at the end. The hostess knocked once, then opened the door and stepped aside. The private dining room was smaller than I expected, dominated by a table set for 3. Candles flickered in silver holders. Wine glasses caught the light like captured stars. And sitting at the head of the table, rising as I entered, was Domenico Salvatore. He looked different than he had in the diner, more relaxed somehow, though no less dangerous. He'd removed his jacket, his white shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms that suggested he was more than just a man who signed papers and gave orders. A watch that probably cost more than a car circled his wrist. The signet ring still gleamed on his left hand. "Sarah." My name in his voice was different than it had been yesterday, warmer, almost intimate. "Thank you for coming." Elena sat to his right, smiling at me with genuine pleasure. "You look beautiful, dear. I knew that dress would suit you." I stood frozen in the doorway, suddenly aware of how out of place I was, how this silk dress couldn't hide what I was. A waitress from a failing diner who didn't belong in rooms like this, with people like this. "Please, sit." Domenico gestured to the chair opposite Elena, across from him. When I didn't move immediately, he added more softly, "You're safe here. I promise." The word promise from his mouth carried weight. I found myself moving forward, my feet carrying me to the chair before my brain caught up. He held it for me, pushing it in as I sat, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, something dark and woody with notes of bergamot. Expensive. Everything about him was expensive. He returned to his seat, and for a moment, we just looked at each other across the table. His eyes in the candlelight were the color of dark honey, warmer than I remembered, but still sharp, still assessing. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, whether he saw past the dress to the fear underneath, the exhaustion that no amount of makeup could fully hide. "You're wondering why you're here," he said. Not a question. Among other things, a slight smile tugged at his lips. "I appreciate directness. It's rare. In your world, maybe. In every world." He poured wine into my glass, something red that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "My grandmother tells me you were kind to her, that you helped her without expectation of reward." "I was doing my job. No." Elena leaned forward, her gray eyes intent. "You went beyond your job. You sat with me. You read to me. You made me feel human rather than—" She paused, choosing her words carefully, "rather than a burden." I took a sip of wine to avoid responding. It tasted like velvet and dark fruit and something I couldn't identify. It tasted like everything I'd been missing without knowing it existed. "She also tells me you're struggling," Domenico continued, and I felt my spine stiffen. "Working yourself to exhaustion for wages that barely keep you alive. No family, no safety net. One emergency away from homelessness." "I'm fine," I said automatically. The lie I'd told myself so many times it almost felt true. "You're not fine." He said it gently, but firmly. "And there's no shame in admitting it. The world is designed to grind people like you into dust. You work hard, you follow the rules, and you still can't get ahead because the system is rigged against you. And you're part of that system," I pointed out, meeting his eyes. "You're part of what's rigged." Something flashed in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or approval. "I am. I don't pretend otherwise." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "But I also believe in taking care of people who show loyalty, who show character. And you showed both to my grandmother. So this is a job offer? No. He paused as servers entered, placing plates in front of us, some kind of fish with vegetables I'd never seen before, arranged like art. They disappeared as silently as they'd arrived. This is an opportunity, a chance to stop drowning. I looked down at the food, my stomach knotting with hunger and anxiety in equal measure. What kind of opportunity? Elena answered instead. We'd like to help you, Sarah. Get you out of that apartment, out of that job. Give you space to breathe, to figure out what you actually want from life instead of just surviving it. Why? The question came out harsher than intended. You don't know me. I helped an old woman read a menu. That doesn't make me special. It does to us, Domenico said quietly. Family is everything to us. Blood family, yes, but also chosen family. People who prove themselves trustworthy, loyal. He picked up his fork, cut a precise piece of fish. My grandmother rarely asks me for anything, but she asked me to help you, so I'm offering. Offering what, exactly? A place to live. Secure. Safe. No rent. No utilities. No worrying about the electricity being shut off. A stipend to cover your expenses. Time to figure out what you want to do with your life beyond serving coffee to truckers. It sounded too good to be true. In my experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually came with invisible price tags that would bankrupt your soul. And in exchange, he said, watching me carefully, you spend time with my grandmother, keep her company, help her with whatever she needs, be her companion. I blinked. That's it? You're offering me free housing and money to hang out with Elena? She's lonely, Domenico said, and for the first time, I heard something raw in his voice. She's 83 years old. Her husband died 10 years ago. Her children are gone. I'm busy with... He gestured vaguely. Business. She needs someone who sees her as a person, not as the matriarch of a crime family, someone who will talk to her like you did in the diner. Someone genuine. I looked at Elena, who was watching me with those sharp gray eyes. Is this what you want? Yes, she said simply. I liked you, Sarah. I liked how you treated me. I'd like to spend more time with you. And if Domenico can help you in the process, that seems like a fair exchange. I should have said no. Every survival instinct I'd honed over years of bad decisions and worse luck screamed at me to run, to get up from this table and disappear back into my anonymous life where I was invisible, but at least I was my own. But I was so tired of being invisible. And the offer, the impossible, generous, terrifying offer, was a lifeline thrown to someone who'd been drowning for so long I'd forgotten what air tasted like. Where would I live? Something shifted in Domenico's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Like he'd known I'd ask that question. Like he'd been waiting for it. There's a guest house on my property. Small, private. It's currently unused. He took a sip of wine. You'd have your own space, your own entrance, privacy. But you'd be close enough to visit my grandmother regularly. She lives in the main house. And you? I also live in the main house. He set down his glass, his gaze never leaving mine. But I'm rarely there. Business keeps me occupied most hours of the day. You'd barely see me. I wasn't sure if that was reassuring or disappointing, both feelings twisted together in my chest in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. Can I think about it? Of course. Elena reached across the table, patting my hand. This is a big decision. Take your time. But Domenico leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and when he spoke, his voice was low and serious. The offer expires in 3 days. Not because I'm trying to pressure you, but because if you decline, we'll need to make other arrangements for my grandmother's care. I need to know if you're in or out. 3 days to decide if I wanted to accept help from a crime family. 3 days to choose between my current life, exhausting, lonely, slowly killing me, and whatever this new life might be. 3 days to figure out if I was brave enough or desperate enough or stupid enough to take the hand being offered, even if I couldn't see where it would lead. We ate dinner, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Elena asked about my favorite books, my taste in music, what I'd wanted to be as a child before life got in the way. Domenico mostly listened, occasionally adding a comment or question, his presence a constant weight even when he wasn't speaking. I found myself relaxing slightly, the wine warming my blood, the food, the best I'd ever tasted, grounding me in the moment. But underneath the pleasant conversation, I felt the current of something else. The way Domenico's eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way Elena watched our interactions with a knowing smile, the way the air seemed to thicken whenever his hand moved near mine on the table, never quite touching but close enough that I felt the heat of his skin. When the evening ended, Domenico walked me down to the car himself. Elena had said her goodbyes upstairs, hugging me with surprising strength and whispering, "Say yes, dear. Please say yes." The night air was cool after the warmth of the restaurant. Domenico's hand appeared at the small of my back, not quite touching, just hovering, as he guided me down the steps. I was hyper-aware of that almost touch, of how my body leaned slightly toward it, despite my brain's protests. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, as we reached the SUV. "I know this was probably terrifying." "Probably?" I laughed, but it came out shaky. "I'm pretty sure I've been terrified since the moment Elena told me who you were." "Good." I looked up at him, startled. "Good?" "Fear means you're smart enough to understand the situation, smart enough to be careful." His eyes met mine, and in the dim light from the restaurant, they looked almost black again. "But don't let fear be the only thing you feel." "What else should I feel?" He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to devastating. "Hope, maybe, possibility. The sense that your life could be different. Better." "Different isn't always better," I said quietly. "No," he agreed, "but sometimes it is. Sometimes different saves your life." The driver opened the door, and I started to get in, but Domenico's voice stopped me. "Sarah?" I turned back, and he was closer than I expected, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. "Whatever you decide," he said, "know that you'd be safe with us. I protect what's mine, and if you accept this offer, you'd be mine to protect." The possessiveness in those words should have sent me running. Instead, I felt something warm unfurl in my chest, something dangerously close to wanting. I got in the car without responding, and he closed the door gently. As we pulled away, I watched him through the tinted window, standing in the courtyard with his hands in his pockets, watching me leave. Even at a distance, even through darkened glass, I could feel the weight of his gaze. The dress was still on my bed when I got home, a reminder that this had been real, that tomorrow I'd wake up and have to decide. 3 days. I pulled out my phone and Googled the Salvatore family again, reading until my eyes burned and my phone battery dropped to 5%. Every article painted the same picture. Power, violence, control, a family that had ruled this city's underworld for generations. Men who made problems disappear, women who looked the other way, a world where loyalty meant everything, and betrayal meant death. I should have been terrified, but all I could think about was Domenico's voice saying you'd be mine to protect, and how that had felt like the safest I'd been in years. I lasted 2 more shifts at the diner before I made my decision. The first shift, the morning after the dinner, I moved through my routine like a ghost. Every table felt heavier, every order more exhausting, Maurice's voice more grating than usual. The coffee smelled burnt, the eggs looked gray, and the customers seemed to blur together into one faceless mass of demands and complaints and quarters left as tips. When I got home that night, my feet were bleeding through my socks. The duct tape on my shoes had finally given up entirely, and I'd spent 8 hours walking on cardboard I'd stuffed inside to cover the holes. I sat on my mattress and peeled the socks away from dried blood, wondering how much longer I could do this. How many more shifts until my body simply gave out? The second shift was worse. Maurice docked my pay for the coffee pot I'd broken. $50 I couldn't afford to lose. A customer grabbed my ass while I was refilling his water, and when I reported it, Morris told me to be more careful about how I leaned over tables. The electricity in my apartment building went out halfway through my shift, which meant when I got home, I'd have no light, no way to cook the expired ramen that was all I had left in my cupboard. I sat in the dark that night, eating cold ramen with my fingers because I couldn't find a fork, and thought about Domenico's words. Sometimes different saves your life. I called the number on the card Elena had given me at 3 a.m., sitting on my floor with my phone on its last 2% battery. A man answered on the first ring. Yes? This is Sarah Mitchell. I'd like to speak to Mr. Salvatore, or Elena, about the offer. One moment. The line clicked, and I waited, my heart hammering, half expecting to be told it was too late, that the offer had been rescinded, that I'd waited too long and missed my only chance at a different life. Then his voice, rough with sleep, but instantly alert. Sarah. Just my name, but the way he said it made my stomach flip. Like he'd been waiting for this call, like he'd known I'd break. I'll do it, I said before I could change my mind. The arrangement, with Elena, I'll accept your offer. Silence on the other end, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, you're sure? No, I admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. I could hear the smile in his voice. Good. Can you be ready in 3 hours? 3. What? It's 3 in the morning. I know. But your landlord is filing for eviction tomorrow morning. You have unpaid rent going back 3 months. I'd rather have you out of there before the paperwork is filed. A pause. Unless you'd prefer to wait? He'd been monitoring my situation, tracking my rent status. The thought should have creeped me out, but instead, I felt a strange sense of relief that someone had been paying attention, that someone had noticed I was drowning before I went under completely. 3 hours, I agreed. A car will be there at 6. Pack everything you want to keep. Everything else? Leave it. The line went dead. I looked around my studio apartment. At the water-stained ceiling, the broken blinds, the mattress on the floor, the milk crates I used as furniture. What did I want to keep? My clothes fit in 2 garbage bags. Some photos of my mother before the drinking got bad. A battered copy of Jane Eyre I'd stolen from a free library box because I'd loved the story of a woman who refused to settle for scraps. By the time the sun started to rise, painting my apartment in shades of gray and gold, I'd packed my entire life into 3 bags and a backpack. It was depressing how little I had to show for 26 years of existence. How completely I could disappear from this place without leaving a trace. The SUV arrived exactly at 6. Same driver as before, same professional silence. He took my bags without comment, loading them into the back while I took one last look at the building that had housed me for the past year. I felt nothing. No nostalgia, no regret. Just a hollow sense of closing a door on a room I'd never wanted to enter in the first place. The drive took longer this time, heading out of the city entirely. Into the hills where houses became estates, and estates became kingdoms hidden behind walls and gates. We turned onto a private road that wound through manicured grounds. Actual grass, actual gardens, trees that looked like they'd been planted by someone's great-grandfather, and tended ever since. The house appeared around a bend, and I felt my breath catch. It wasn't just a house. It was a compound. The main building was 3 stories of stone and glass, Mediterranean architecture with terracotta roofs and arched windows that caught the morning light. Wings extended on either side, and beyond them, I could see other structures, a pool house, what looked like a guest cottage, some kind of garage that probably held more cars than I'd owned in my lifetime. We drove past the main house, following a gravel path that curved through more gardens, and stopped in front of a smaller building tucked behind a grove of olive trees. The guest house. But calling it a guest house was like calling the ocean damp. It was a cottage straight out of a fairy tale. Stone walls covered in climbing roses. A blue door with an iron knocker shaped like a lion's head. Windows with actual shutters. The driver opened my door. "Welcome home, Ms. Mitchell." Home. The word felt foreign. He carried my bags to the door, which opened before we reached it. A woman in her 50s stood in the doorway, dressed simply but elegantly in slacks and a cardigan, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Sarah," she said warmly. "I'm Maria. I manage the household. Mr. Salvatore asked me to help you get settled." The interior of the cottage was even more stunning than the exterior. An open floor plan with exposed beams, a kitchen with actual granite counters and appliances that looked like they'd never been used, a living room with furniture that was probably worth more than everything I'd owned combined. Maria showed me the bedroom, king-sized bed with fluffy white linens, a closet bigger than my entire previous apartment, an ensuite bathroom with a tub I could drown in. The cottage is fully stocked, Maria explained, opening the refrigerator to show me shelves full of actual food, fresh fruit, vegetables, cheeses I couldn't name, bottles of wine and juice and everything else a person could possibly need. But you're also welcome to eat in the main house. Elena would love to have you join her for meals. I nodded, overwhelmed, unable to form words. Take today to settle in, Maria continued. Unpack, rest. Elena would like to see you tomorrow morning if you're available. 10 o'clock in the main house. I'll come get you. After she left, I stood in the middle of the cottage and tried to process what had just happened. 48 hours ago, I'd been serving coffee in a diner, my feet bleeding, my electricity shut off, one paycheck away from the street. Now I stood in a place that looked like it belonged in a magazine, surrounded by luxury I'd never imagined. With a refrigerator full of food and a bed that probably cost more than my yearly salary, I should have felt relief, gratitude, joy. Instead, I felt the weight of debt accumulating because nothing was free, nothing was ever free. And I'd just accepted help from people who operated outside the law, who solved problems with violence, who made people disappear. But I'm here, I thought, running my hand over the cool granite countertop. I'm safe. I'm fed. I have a bed and a roof, and no one is threatening to evict me. That had to count for something. I spent the day unpacking my 3 bags into a space that made my belongings look even more pathetic than they had in my apartment. My clothes barely filled a quarter of the closet. My photos looked lost on the vast dresser. The stolen copy of Jane Eyre sat alone on a bookshelf that could hold hundreds of volumes, but when I showered, in water that was actually hot, with water pressure that didn't sputter and die, and then collapsed onto the bed, I slept for 12 hours straight. No nightmares about eviction notices, no waking up in a panic about bills. Just deep, dreamless sleep in sheets that smelled like lavender and felt like clouds. I woke to afternoon sunlight streaming through windows I hadn't bothered to close, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. Then it all came rushing back, the cottage, the offer, the decision I'd made at 3 a.m. that had completely changed my life. There was a knock at the door. I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, my nicest ones, which still looked shabby in these surroundings, and opened the door to find Domenico Salvatore standing on my doorstep. He was dressed more casually than I'd seen him before. Dark jeans, a black t-shirt that showed off shoulders that definitely didn't come from signing papers. But even dressed down, he carried himself with that same dangerous authority, that sense that he was always the most powerful person in any room. You slept, he observed, his eyes traveling over my face. Good. You needed it. Yes. Thank you. For all of this, I gestured vaguely at the cottage, at everything. It's too much. It's exactly enough. He shifted his weight, and I realized he seemed almost uncomfortable. Unsure. It was strange seeing that on him, humanizing in a way that made him more dangerous, not less. May I come in? I stepped back, letting him enter. He moved through the space with the ease of someone who owned it, which he did. But his eyes kept returning to me, tracking my movements as I nervously tidied things that didn't need tidying. My grandmother is very pleased you accepted, he said, stopping by the bookshelf and pulling out my copy of Jane Eyre. He studied it, thumbing through pages that were dog-eared and coffee-stained. This is your favorite? How did you... You've read it enough times to nearly destroy it. He smiled slightly. I appreciate a woman who knows what she wants and holds on to it. He set the book down and turned to face me fully, leaning against the bookshelf with his arms crossed. The casual pose should have made him less intimidating. It didn't. There are rules, he said. Things you need to understand if you're going to live here. My stomach tightened. What kind of rules? Nothing unreasonable, but important. He ticked them off on his fingers. First, you don't ask questions about my business. You see things. You hear things. You forget them. Understand? I nodded. Second, you don't leave the property without informing Maria or one of the security team. It's for your safety. There are people who would hurt you to get to me or my grandmother. I need to know where you are. So I'm a prisoner? His expression darkened. You're protected. There's a difference. You can come and go as you please, but I need to be able to keep you safe. That means knowing your location, okay? I said quietly. Third. He pushed off from the bookshelf, closing the distance between us until he was close enough that I could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his body. You're off limits to my men, all of them. You're under my protection, which means no one touches you, no one threatens you, no one makes you uncomfortable. If anyone does, you tell me immediately. Why would they? Because you're beautiful, he said, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. Because you're living on my property. Because some men are stupid enough to think that means you're available. His eyes met mine, dark and intense. You're not. You're here for my grandmother. That's all. Anyone who forgets that answers to me. The possessiveness in his tone made something warm and dangerous unfurl in my stomach. I should have been offended by the implication that I needed his protection, that I couldn't handle myself. Instead, I felt that same strange safety I'd felt in the restaurant. The sense that someone was finally standing between me and a world that had been trying to destroy me. Is that all? My voice came out breathier than intended. No. He reached up, and I thought he was going to touch my face, but his hand stopped inches away, hovering. One more rule, the most important one. What? Don't fall in love with me. The words hit me like cold water. I laughed, but it sounded hollow. Excuse me? Women always do, he said, and there was something sad in his voice. They see the money, the power, the protection I offer. They mistake it for something it's not. They fall in love with an idea of who I am rather than the reality. He dropped his hand. I'm not a good man, Sarah. I do terrible things to terrible people. I've killed. I've destroyed. I've broken laws and lives without hesitation. I take care of my family, and I eliminate threats. That's who I am. Don't romanticize it. I wouldn't, I stammered, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. Good, but his eyes said something different. They traveled over my face like he was memorizing it, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. Because you deserve better than what I could give you. You deserve someone clean, someone safe. Someone who won't drag you into the darkness. Maybe I'm already in the darkness, I said quietly. Maybe I've been there so long I've forgotten what light looks like. Something flashed in his expression. Hunger, maybe, or recognition. For a moment, we just stood there, close enough to touch but not touching, the air between us electric with everything we weren't saying. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell. Maria will come get you tomorrow morning. Be ready by 9:30. My grandmother likes punctuality. He moved toward the door, and I followed, my mind still spinning from his words. Don't fall in love with me, as if I had any intention of falling for a man who just admitted to being a killer, as if my heart was stupid enough to attach itself to someone so obviously dangerous. He paused at the threshold, looking back at me. Welcome home, Sarah. I hope you find what you're looking for here. Then he was gone, striding back up the path toward the main house with that predatory grace, leaving me standing in the doorway of my fairy tale cottage, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into, and why my heart was racing like I'd just run a marathon. I closed the door and leaned against it, pressing my palm against my chest to feel my heartbeat gradually slow. Don't fall in love with me. It should have been an easy rule to follow. It should have been the easiest one of all. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of surreal normalcy. I spent my mornings with Elena, who turned out to be sharp as a knife despite her age. We'd have coffee in the main house's sunroom, a glass-enclosed space filled with plants that probably cost more than cars, and she'd tell me stories about her life. Not the crime family parts, never that, but stories about growing up in Sicily, about immigrating to America with nothing, about meeting her husband at a church social and knowing immediately he was the one. He was dangerous, she told me one morning, her eyes distant with memory. Everyone said to stay away from him. But danger isn't always bad, Sarah. Sometimes danger is just power that hasn't learned to be gentle yet. I thought about Domenico when she said that. How I'd barely seen him in the week since I'd arrived. Just glimpses as he left early in the morning, or returned late at night. Always surrounded by his men, always on the phone. always moving like a shark that would die if it stopped swimming. The few times our paths crossed, he'd nod politely, ask how I was settling in, then disappear before I could form a response. It was like he was avoiding me. Like that moment in the cottage, the almost touch, the warning not to fall for him, had scared him as much as it had scared me. Afternoons, I explored the property. The gardens were massive, with hidden pathways and secret corners where you could sit and read and forget the world existed. I found a bench under a willow tree that became my favorite spot, where I'd bring books from the main house's library. Actual first editions. Leather-bound volumes that I handled like religious artifacts. Maria checked on me daily, always with some excuse. Did I need anything? Was the cottage comfortable? Would I like to join the staff for dinner? I realized slowly that she was lonely too, that working for a family like the Salvatores meant isolation from the normal world. We became friends, cautiously at first, then more genuinely as the weeks passed. Evenings, I'd return to my cottage and try to process my new reality. I had money now. Domenico had set up an account with what he called a modest stipend that was more than I'd made in 6 months at the diner. I had food, shelter, safety. I had time to breathe, to think, to remember what it felt like to be human instead of just surviving. But I also had questions about the men in suits who came and went at odd hours, about the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, about the night I'd woken to the sound of cars and seen Domenico walking across the grounds with blood on his white shirt, his face carved from stone, his men flanking him like an honor guard returning from war. I didn't ask. That was the first rule. You don't ask questions about my business. But I wondered. God, how I wondered. It was week 7 when everything changed. I was in the garden, reading under my willow tree, when I heard shouting from the main house, male voices, angry and overlapping, then a crash, like furniture breaking. My body went cold, but I stayed frozen on the bench, remembering the rules. Don't ask questions. Stay out of it. But then I heard Elena's voice, sharp with command, and my body moved before my brain caught up. I ran toward the main house, my book falling forgotten in the grass. The side door was open, and I followed the voices to what looked like a study. All dark wood and leather, and the smell of cigars and expensive whiskey. Domenico stood in the center of the room, his jaw tight with fury, facing 3 men I didn't recognize. One of them was younger, maybe mid-30s, with slicked back hair and a suit that screamed new money trying to look like old money. He was gesturing aggressively, his face red. Elena stood between them, tiny and fragile-looking but radiating authority like a nuclear reactor. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Both of you. This is family business, and family doesn't shed blood in my house." "He's not family," the younger man spat, jerking his chin toward Domenico. "He's a bastard who took what should have been mine." He didn't get to finish. Domenico moved faster than I could track, closing the distance and slamming the man against the wall hard enough to rattle the paintings. His forearm pressed against the man's throat, and I could see the veins standing out in his neck, the barely controlled violence in every line of his body. "Say that again," Domenico said softly, dangerously. "Please, give me an excuse." "Domenico." Elena's voice was sharp. "Not here. Not now." That's when the younger man's eyes found me, standing frozen in the doorway. His lips curved into something ugly. "That her? The new pet you're keeping? Does she know what you are? What you do to people who—" I didn't see Domenico's fist move. 1 second the man was talking. The next he was on the floor, blood pouring from his nose, his eyes dazed. "Get him out of here," Domenico said to the other 2 men, who I now realized were the younger man's bodyguards. "And tell Carlo that if he sends his son to my house again to threaten my grandmother in my territory, I'll send him back in pieces." The men dragged their boss out, and suddenly the room was silent, except for the sound of Domenico's harsh breathing. He stood with his back to me, his shoulders rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Elena sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 83 years. "Sarah, you shouldn't have seen that. I heard you. I thought—" My voice wouldn't work properly. "She thought you needed help," Domenico said, turning to face me. There was blood on his knuckles, but his eyes were what scared me. They were empty. cold. The warm amber was gone, replaced by something that looked like the abyss staring back. Did you think you could protect my grandmother? Did you think you could stop this? I didn't think, I admitted. I heard her and I ran. Something shifted in his expression. The ice cracked, just a little. You ran toward the danger. You didn't even hesitate. She's my friend, I said simply. Elena moved toward me, taking my hands in hers. Go back to your cottage, dear. Please. This isn't something you should be part of. But Domenico was still staring at me. And I saw the exact moment something changed in his eyes, the moment the careful distance he'd maintained for 7 weeks shattered like glass. No, he said quietly. She stays. She's already in this. The moment she ran toward the danger instead of away from it, she made herself part of it. Domenico, Elena started, but he cut her off. Carlo's son saw her. He knows she's here. He knows she matters. His jaw clenched. She's a target now. My stomach dropped. What does that mean? He crossed the room toward me and I saw Elena quietly slip out, leaving us alone. He stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with sweat and adrenaline. It means the rules just changed, he said. It means you can't just be my grandmother's companion anymore. It means I have to keep you closer. It means... He stopped, something warring in his expression. Means what? It means I've been an idiot. He reached up, and this time his hand didn't stop. His fingers traced my jaw, tilted my face up toward his. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands that had just broken a man's nose. I've been avoiding you, staying away, trying to follow my own rule about not falling for you. My breath caught. And I've been failing miserably. His thumb brushed across my lower lip. Every time I see you in the garden with a book. Every time I hear you laughing with my grandmother. Every time I come home late and see your light on, knowing you're in that cottage, safe and warm and mine to protect. He stopped, his eyes searching mine. I told you not to fall in love with me. I should have been warning myself. Domenico, let me finish. His other hand came up to frame my face, and the tenderness in the gesture made my throat tight. I'm a bad man. I do terrible things. The man whose nose I just broke, he's right. I've taken things that weren't mine. I've killed people who got in my way. I've built an empire on blood and fear and violence. That's who I am. That's what I'll always be. Then why? Because you look at me and you don't see that, he said, his voice rough. You see something else. Something I thought I'd buried so deep it didn't exist anymore. You see someone worth running toward instead of away from. And I'm selfish enough, broken enough, to want that. To want you. Even though I shouldn't. Even though you deserve so much better. I should have been terrified. He'd just confirmed everything I'd suspected. The violence, the crimes, the darkness. But all I could think about was his hands on my face, the vulnerability in his eyes, the way my body had been aching for this moment since the first time I'd seen him in the diner. What if I don't want better? I whispered. What if I want this? You? He made a sound low in his throat, half growl, half groan, and then his mouth was on mine. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was possession and desperation, and 7 weeks of denied wanting all crashing together at once. His hands slid into my hair, angling my head exactly where he wanted it, and I pressed closer, my fingers digging into his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine. His eyes closed. This is a mistake, he murmured. Probably, I agreed. You're still going to end up hurt, maybe. He opened his eyes, and the intensity in them stole my breath. But you're mine now. You understand that? Mine to protect. Mine to keep safe. Mine. The possessiveness should have scared me. Instead, it felt like finally coming home after years of wandering. Yours, I agreed. The next weeks were different. Domenico stopped avoiding me. Instead, I found myself pulled deeper into his world. Not the criminal parts, never that, but the rest of it. Dinners in the main house with him and Elena, his hand always finding mine under the table. Walks through the garden where he'd tell me about his childhood, about inheriting a legacy he'd never asked for but had learned to master. Nights in the study where he'd work and I'd read, existing in the same space, the silence between us comfortable and warm. The danger he'd warned me about never materialized. Carlo's son disappeared. I didn't ask where, and life settled into a new normal. A normal that included Domenico's hand at the small of my back, his lips on my temple in greeting, the way he'd check on me throughout the day like he couldn't quite believe I was real. Elena watched our relationship develop with knowing eyes and a satisfied smile. I knew, she told me one morning over coffee, from the moment he saw you in the diner. The way he looked at you, I've never seen him look at anyone like that. Like what? Like you were air, and he'd been drowning. 3 months after that first kiss, Domenico took me back to the diner. Maurice had closed it down, couldn't make rent without staff willing to work for nothing. The building was empty now, windows dark, a for lease sign in the window. We stood on the sidewalk outside, and he pulled me against his chest, his chin resting on top of my head. "Do you miss it?" he asked. I thought about the burnt coffee, the bleeding feet, the exhaustion that had seeped into my bones. I thought about being invisible, being nothing, being someone the world looked through rather than at. "No," I said honestly. "I don't miss any of it. Good." He turned me in his arms so I was facing him. "Because I'm never letting you go back to that life. Never letting you be invisible again. You're mine, Sarah. And I take care of what's mine." He kissed me there on the sidewalk, in front of the diner where we'd first met, where I'd helped an old woman read a menu and accidentally changed my entire life. When he pulled back, he was smiling. That devastating smile that transformed his face and made me forget he was dangerous. "Come on," he said, taking my hand. "Let's go home." Home. The cottage that had become mine. The property where I was safe. The family I'd found in Elena and Maria, and even the guards who nodded respectfully when I passed. The man who'd pulled me from drowning and taught me how to breathe again. 6 months later, on a morning that smelled like jasmine and coffee, Domenico found me in the garden under my willow tree. He was carrying something, a small box covered in velvet. "I have something for you," he said, sitting beside me on the bench. "Another gift? You already give me everything." "Not everything. Not yet." He opened the box to reveal a ring, a simple band with a single diamond that caught the sunlight and threw rainbows across the grass. "I'm not a good man, Sarah. I'll never be a good man, but I'm yours. Completely. Irrevocably. And I'm asking, begging, for you to be mine. Officially. Forever." My hands shook as I reached for the ring. "You're asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to choose this life. This darkness. Me, knowing exactly what I am and what it means." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. Hope and fear and love all tangled together. "I'll understand if you say no, if you want something cleaner, something safer." I kissed him, cutting off the words. When I pulled back, I was crying, but for the first time in my life, they were happy tears. "Yes," I said. "Yes to all of it. The darkness, the danger, you, all of it. Yes." He slid the ring onto my finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled me into his lap, burying his face in my neck. I felt him breathe deeply, like he was trying to memorize my scent, the feel of me in his arms. "I love you," he murmured against my skin. "I shouldn't. It makes me weak, makes you a target. But I love you anyway. I love you desperately. I love you too," I whispered back. "My dangerous, beautiful, broken man. I love you too." We were married a month later in the garden under the willow tree, with Elena crying happy tears and Maria fussing over my dress. White silk that Domenico had chosen, that fit perfectly because he knew every inch of me by heart. His men stood as witnesses, dangerous men in expensive suits who'd kill for him without question, but who smiled at the ceremony like they'd never seen their boss happy before. When he kissed me as his wife, he whispered against my lips, "You saved me. You know that? You walked into my life in a diner, helping my grandmother, and you saved me without even trying." "We saved each other," I corrected, because it was true. He'd pulled me from drowning, but I'd taught him how to feel human again. He'd given me safety and protection, but I'd given him love and vulnerability. We were both broken things that had found each other and somehow made something whole. That night, in our bedroom in the main house, I'd moved from the cottage after the engagement. He held me close and traced lazy patterns on my skin. "No regrets?" he asked. I thought about the girl I'd been 6 months ago. Invisible. Exhausted. Slowly dying in a grease-stained diner. I thought about the woman I'd become. Loved, protected, cherished by a dangerous man who'd chosen to be gentle with me, who'd given me a family, a purpose, a life that felt worth living. "Not a single one," I said. And I meant it. Years later, when people would ask how we met, I'd tell them the truth. I was a waitress who helped an old woman not knowing she was the Mafia boss's mother testing me. I'd been kind without expecting reward, genuine without knowing I was being observed, and that single act of compassion had led to this, to love, to family, to a life I never could have imagined. Elena would always smile when I told that story, reaching over to pat my hand with her papery fingers. "I knew the moment I saw you," she'd say. "I knew you were exactly what my grandson needed, what our family needed, someone real, someone who chose kindness even when it cost them." Domenico would pull me close and kiss my temple, his way of showing affection in front of others. And I'd lean into him, this dangerous man who'd become my everything, and silently thank whatever fate had led me to that diner on that particular day. Because some mistakes turn out to be the best decisions you ever make. Some dangers are worth running toward. And sometimes, the darkness isn't something to fear. It's just power that's finally learned to be gentle. At least, that's what Elena always said. And she was never wrong.